I would like to welcome y'all here this evening to our forage production workshop. Appreciate you joining us this evening. Would ask that for those of y'all who are joining us and needing CEUs in the text chat, please type your name just so we have a record that you are participating with us this evening. Also, during the course of the program, if you do have questions, you can type those in that text chat feature, which you can find towards the bottom of your screen. It'll be a little balloon bubble that says chat. Or also, if you would like, you can save your questions until the very end, and we'll have the opportunity to answer your questions at that point. At this point, or at this time, I would like to introduce our program speaker this evening, Dr. Vanessa Corriher-Olson. She is a professor and our forage extension specialist with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service based out of Overton. So she is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to forage production. And so if you have any questions at all this evening, this is your opportunity to get them answered. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Olson, and we appreciate you joining us this evening.
All right. Thanks, Richard. So like you said, my name is Vanessa Corriher-Olson. I am the forage specialist at Overton, and we are going to cover as much ground as possible in a brief period of time today in regards to forage production. So forage production is, overly, involves a lot of aspects, along with forage species selection and establishment, weed control, fertilization, grazing management, or harvesting potentially. So we're going to do our best to cover as much as possible and kind of give a broad overview to a lot of aspects of forage production. But I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have that might be a little bit more specific. So as we start talking about forage production, the first thing we need to remember as forage producers is to think about what our goal of our forage system is. So everyone has different goals. A lot of people in Central and East Texas, one of their primary goals is livestock production, primarily beef cattle, very popular. But that may be part of your goals. There may be additional goals such as wildlife. You may have an interest in hunting and attracting white-tailed deer to your property, or you may just be interested in supporting wildlife habitat, whether it's for deer, birds, or small mammals, or other wildlife species. So your forage system may have more than one singular goal, maybe a combination of things. And that'll be really important to keep in mind as we move forward in our thoughts as far as our management for our particular property. So everything's going to be very site specific and should fit within your forage system. So that is something to keep in mind. And when we talk about different forage species, one thing about Texas is we have great variability, not only in average annual rainfall, as you can see in this map. I'm located in East Texas in Rusk County, so on the 38 to 46 as far as average annual rainfall, which feels like most recently this past week or last week, we got a good majority of that. We got well over 5 inches in a matter of a couple of days, even at my house in Smith County. And so obviously in the eastern part of the state, we do have higher average annual rainfall. And as we move west, our average annual rainfall does tend to decline. So depending on where you and your property are, that can influence obviously the average annual precipitation, the risk of drought or dry conditions, and that will also influence the forage species that you select to utilize. There's many forage species that we use primarily east of I-35 because of that higher average annual rainfall compared to the western part of our state, which is much more arid. Another aspect of forage species selection will be our soil type. Now, this is kind of a broad generalization. If you've ever seen a soil map for Texas, it has more colors than this. This is just 10 different colors. And this shows vegetational areas of Texas. And that is going to be influenced by soil type as well as average annual rainfall as far as the vegetation that we can grow in various parts of our state. So being familiar with your property, your soil type, your average annual rainfall, as well as your goals will be important as we start to make, or as we make decisions about the forage species that we grow on our property or that we support on our property. So it should be customized to your operation, your soil type, as well as your resources as far as the forages that you grow on your property. And it may not be one singular forage. Monoculture systems or a singular species or variety within a forage system are fairly popular throughout the southeast of the United States and have been popular for several years, primarily for pasture and hay production. But that may not necessarily fit your particular production system within your forage system goals. So do keep that in mind. What works for someone else may not necessarily be, or may not necessarily work for you based on various aspects of your location, such as soil type and rainfall. If you're not familiar with the soils or, the soil or the different soils that are on your property, the Web Soil Survey is an excellent resource that is free. The NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, has over time collected soil data across the United States. And you may be familiar with having historically gone to your NRC office and looking at actual physical soil maps. And they still have those and you can still do that. But since, in the past couple of years, they've actually put all of that into a database online that is free. The best way to locate this website is just to type in Web Soil Survey, just to Google, Yahoo search Web Soil Survey. That's what I do anytime I want to use this site. You can click the green button to start the website or to start the program. All you need is either a physical address for the property or a physical address that you can use as a starting point to locate your property. So a lot of us, our property probably doesn't have a physical address, but there may be a physical address close by, or if not, we can always use GPS coordinates. You put in that information and this website will give you a bird's eye view of your property. Then using some of their tools, you can highlight all of your property or portions of your property to determine the different soil types. And likely most of us have a variety of soil types. Even if we feel like majority of our soil is very sandy or black, heavy clays, there's likely greater variability than what we perceive. And with that information, we can determine, or we can use the soil characteristics within the system. It will tell us whether that is a well-drained site, poorly drained site, the water holding capacity. We'll share a lot of information that can help us whenever it comes to making decisions as to what to grow or to plant on our property as far as forages. So there are a lot of different forages that we can utilize within our forage systems. This is just a short list of the grasses that are most commonly grown in Central and East Texas. The base of most of our forage systems throughout the Southeast start with warm season perennials. And primarily in Central and East Texas, that would be Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, which are both introduced species. They are not native to the state of Texas. As we get more central, closer to the central part of the state and west, we have greater utilization of some of our native species that are warm season perennials. And that would include things like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, eastern gamma grass, grama. So there's a lot of different grasses, perennial grasses that we can utilize in Texas for forage production, whether it's to support wildlife habitat or to support livestock or for hay production, depending on our specific forage system. There are also some other grasses, annuals that can be incorporated into our forage system, whether they're warm season annuals, such as forage sorghum, sorghum Sudan grass, crabgrass, which is more commonly viewed as a weed. It's actually a very valuable forage. And it's important if we're trying to support livestock to understand the value of some of these forages. Any of our annual species are going to be higher in nutritive value than our perennials. So if we look within the warm seasons, Crabgrass is higher in nutritive value than Bermuda grass. So most people view crabgrass as a weed, but it actually has quite a bit of value as far as a forage. There are also cool season forages. We utilize more of our annuals in Central and East Texas as opposed to the one perennial. Tall fescue is not well adapted to Texas. It is not drought tolerant. We have had some tall fescue in Overton on the research property, but it was lost over time due to drought and extreme heat and weather conditions that it's just not adapted to. There is still some tall fescue in Northeast Texas when you start getting closer to Arkansas and Oklahoma. Because they have cooler temperatures, they tend to have higher average annual rainfall than other parts of the state. And they have a lot of bottoms areas that hold more moisture along, like, say, the Red River and some of those locations. So there is some tall fescue in Texas, but it is very specific as to where it grows and will persist. But there are cool season annuals that are highly utilized for winter forage, for grazing, or even for harvesting during that spring period. And that would include things like annual ryegrass, our small grains, rye, wheat, and oats. So a lot of different forage options, and these are just grasses. And there are a lot of forbs or broadleaf plants, legumes that can grow during the summer or during the winter/spring that we can utilize for forage production as well. So we have, it's a huge advantage to be able to utilize a lot of different forages. Now, we always have to look at the economics in regards to planting and establishing. With our annual species, they obviously have to be established every season or every year. So that could eventually become costly with seed bed preparation, as well as purchasing seed. And seed availability is always dependent on the source and their production of that particular seed. So a lot of different forages. If you ever have questions, always recommend, if you hear about a forage, to ask more questions about it before you purchase seed, because a lot of our publications are national publications, and they'll talk about plants or species that may not necessarily be adapted to our part of the United States. You have to keep in mind, we're very warm. We tend to have drought conditions, and especially depending on where you are located. So I see there's a question in the chat, so I'll go ahead and address that. And that is, do the annuals reseed themselves? So some of them will. Now, you do have to keep in mind, when you are expecting something to reseed, you have to keep in mind that all of those seeds are not going to germinate that following season. So how much you get from reseeding is going to be less than if you added your own seed or planted additional seed. That is, and we'll take, for example, annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass will reseed. The other thing to keep in mind for overseeding warm season perennials with ryegrass, we recommend planting late September, early October. Any seeds that have reseeded, any seed that was produced during the previous spring potentially, is going to germinate later, substantially later. So that will influence your forage production, the timing of your forage production, and potentially the amount of forage you produce. So if you have an expectation for a certain timing of forage production and a certain amount of forage production, then it's always best to plant new seed. Something like crabgrass will reseed. To increase seed germination of those seeds that have reseeded would require some soil disturbance. That is why a lot of times when we disturb the soil, we might see some crabgrass pop up. The seed was already there, just needed some soil disturbance to promote seed germination. Now, the other warm season annuals, they could potentially reseed, but it's not reliable. That becomes the problem with relying on annual reseeding. A lot of times they're not reliable, and then we have a lot of hybrid varieties. Those tend not to produce a lot of viable seed. So it gets tricky in regards to trying to rely on some of those for reseeding. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted to talk about establishment first. And one of the first, so we talk about establishment of any of our forages. One of the first recommendations is soil testing. And I think this is one of the reasons we see failure of establishment, whether that we're establishing a warm season perennial such as Bermuda grass, or we're interseeding some ryegrass into a stand of established Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. Soil testing is always important just to make sure we do not have any nutrient deficiencies or soil pH issues for that forage that we're then planting. We want to make sure that we have the appropriate soil environment for that plant as it starts to germinate and to grow, because the lack of nutrients or a inappropriate soil pH, maybe a soil that's too acidic, having a very low soil pH, can often lead to failure of germination of some of our species. So it's always important to start with a soil test when you are going to add or make an adjustment, or plant a new forage species that maybe you haven't had on your property before. So when it comes to establishing, planting time is going to be important. So that will always depend on what you are planting. So it's always best to ask well in advance. Most of our warm seasons, whether it's perennials or annuals, we're likely to be planting mid to late April, early May. We may be able to plant earlier depending on weather conditions. We may have to plant later in the season depending on weather conditions. Our annuals are more tolerant of hot and dry conditions, so we can get away with planting them later in that season. Our perennials, I tend not to recommend planting past June, just because we do tend to be hot and drier during June and July, and that makes establishment significantly more challenging. And if you've invested in seed or sprigs, as well as the process of creating a well-prepared seed bed, we would like to be successful with our establishment. So planting time will be dependent on the given forage species, as far as and sometimes the method of which you are planting. Now, obviously, anytime we're planting a perennial, we always recommend planting into a well-prepared seed bed, a clean seed bed, so free of any vegetation, anything that can compete against any of those perennials. The same would go if you were planting any warm season annuals. I do not recommend overseeding a warm season annual into an existing warm season perennial side, because the perennial is already actively growing and is going to outcompete any seeds that try to germinate during that season if you have good growing conditions and you've really supported that warm season perennial. Now, we can overseed our cool season annuals into a warm season perennial side, but there's specific recommendations as far as going through that process to reduce the competition from that Bermuda grass or other warm season perennial forage. So good seed placement will also be critical, and that will be dependent on the seed size. So for a lot of our forage species, Bermuda grass and Bahia grass are very small seeded, so they don't need to be planted too deep, but we still need good seed to soil contact. So as that seed germinates, that root can dig deep into that soil to have access to moisture and nutrients. For some of our larger seeded plants, or species such as our small grains, they need to typically be planted at least an inch deep. So a drill is much easier, a better guarantee on seed placement. So make sure as you are prior to planting, you are aware of what's the best recommendation or what's the appropriate seed depth. And a lot of things we can get planted with minimal equipment oftentimes. Or there may be equipment close by that you can rent or lease, or maybe a neighbor has something that you could borrow to help with that seed placement. And then proper seeding rate, always follow recommendations. I would pay attention to the tag on a particular bag of seed that you have purchased. For things like Bermuda grass, that seed may come coated, or some of our legumes often come coated. That means they have added a protective layer for various reasons to Bermuda grass. They often include a fungicide or some nutrients to help promote seed germination and decrease any seed disease issues that might occur. So that coating will add additional weight. So that can often change your seeding rate depending on a particular product. So always pay attention to the recommendations for that specific brand, that species, as far as the appropriate seeding rate, the best recommendation. And then, of course, during establishment, especially if we are starting from scratch, whether we're planting a warm season perennial into a clean seed bed or even an annual warm season annual into a clean seed bed, weed control is going to be important and may be challenging because any seedlings or sprigs are often very sensitive to herbicides. And so we may have limitations as far as our methods or the herbicides that we can use to control any weeds during that establishment season. If you are planning a warm season perennial or any warm season annuals, ideally we need to start with a prepared seed bed, a well-prepared seed bed. So that is achieved by plowing, disking, and finishing at least 2 to 4 weeks prior to planting, whether it's with sprigs for hybrid Bermuda grass or seeds for any of our warm season annuals or seeded Bermuda grass or even Bahia grass. During that seed preparation time, we can incorporate any lime, phosphorus, and potassium that we need to support that new stand and to make sure we have the nutrients appropriate for forage growth and persistence. And phosphorus will be really important during establishment because phosphorus is important for root growth and development. So it will be important that if we are establishing a new forage species, that we have adequate phosphorus to support that root growth and development. If you are preparing a clean seed bed, it should be firm, but still have some give to it. Your boot track should be no more than about 1/4 inch deep. This is a good visual. You do want to leave an imprint. You don't want to sink down to your ankles, and you don't want to be able to walk across and not leave any type of indentation or any imprint. So it needs to be soft but firm. And so using your boots is a good means of measuring that, of determining that you have the appropriate compactness or the appropriate soil situation or the best prepared seed bed for that new planting. So I mentioned earlier soil testing, and this is going to be important even for established forages. And I spent a lot of time talking about soil testing and soil fertility, and especially right now when fertilizer prices are twice what they have been in previous years and very expensive and people start looking for alternatives. Whenever it comes to making fertilizer decisions, the only place, in my opinion, to start is with a soil test. So if you have a hay meadow, I recommend collecting samples every year because you are constantly changing the soil nutrient status within a hay meadow because you are harvesting that forage, you are feeding it to your cattle off-site, you are selling it to a neighbor. So you're removing those nutrients in those round bells or square bells. In a pasture system, our cattle or livestock are recycling those nutrients. Ruminants, so cattle, only keep about 10 to 30% of the nutrients they ingest. The other 70 to 90 is recycled back into that pasture through their feces and urine. So soil testing for a pasture system, I typically recommend every 2 to 3 years. You might even be able to get away with every 5 as long as you're not having issues. If you see a shift in production or you want to incorporate or make changes to your forage systems, I always recommend starting with a soil analysis. Sampling depth is 0 to 6 inches for routine soil analysis. Now, granted, there may be nutrients deeper in the soil profile, so you could always take a deeper sample, but that obviously becomes much more labor intensive. But a 6-inch soil sample is appropriate for a routine soil analysis that will give you your soil pH, your major or your primary nutrients, and some micronutrients as well. So for soil sampling, we need to collect 15 to 20 cores for each management area. So a management area is going to be a uniform field or portion of a field that's no larger than about 40 to 50 acres that has the same forage species within that location that's going to be fertilized and has been managed the same. You're going to collect those cores randomly within that management area, mix those in a clean plastic bucket, and then you'll fill a sample bag or you will send a pint of soil to College Station, to the soil water forage testing lab there in College Station. If you collect forms and bags from your county extension office, those bags are marked with the amount of soil that needs to be sent. If not, you need to make sure that you're sending a pint of soil at least. And You're basically creating a composite sample for that one management area. So if you have 3 different management areas, you have a pasture, hay meadow, and maybe another pasture of a different forage species, you're basically sending 3 samples to represent each of those management areas. Now, if you have 150 acres, it's Bermuda grass that's only used for pasture, or is used for pasture and hay production, but it's managed the same, then you would only need 1 composite sample. So you're still taking that 15 to 20 cores within that 50 acres, but you're creating 1 sample. A lot of people get confused and think they have to send 15 to 20 samples to the lab, and that's not the case unless you have that many management areas. A routine soil analysis is going to cost you about $12 at College Station. There are other labs. Just keep in mind that if you make sure you understand the procedures that those labs use. If you have questions, you can always visit with your county agent or myself. You can always call back to that specific lab. I realize there's a lot of retailers in Central and East Texas that will do campaigns, or they'll send, if you buy fertilizer from them, or to try to get you to buy fertilizer for them, they'll send soil samples off, and not all of them use university labs. A lot of times they'll use some of the commercial labs across the US. So, but we'll do our best to help you. But their information may read very differently than what we're most familiar with at College Station, or what you may be historically familiar with. So a lot of people get confused with that. So this is kind of a condensed version of what you would see from College Station. They will tell you your soil pH at the top. This sample was sent for hybrid Bermuda grass. It's not irrigated, obviously it's harvested for hay with an anticipation of 3 cuttings. And that is information that will be important, and that is what the lab bases their recommendations on as far as what you are trying to achieve. And then it will tell you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is available based on that soil sample in that management area, along with calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then they'll give you recommendations based on what was available in that soil. Now, a lot of us don't think in parts per million. So what I recommend is multiplying that parts per million by 2, and that will give you pounds per acre. So that makes a lot more sense to most of us. So 21 parts per million of nitrate nitrogen, that's nitrogen that's readily available for plant utilization. So if you convert that to pounds per acre, it's 42 pounds per acre. Now, to produce a ton of Bermuda grass, you need 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So obviously that's not enough to produce 1 ton, much less to support 3 cuttings. You will also notice at the very bottom, under the table, there will be additional recommendations. It may be about splitting a potassium application for Bermuda grass. Obviously in this scenario under nitrogen, it recommends additional nitrogen between each hay cutting to support that second and third harvest. So if you ever have questions about a soil analysis, have difficulty understanding what is meant or how to best follow those recommendations, always reach out to a county extension agent or someone like myself, and we're happy to sit down and kind of walk through that with you, and maybe guide you a bit better. You can always call the lab as well, but keep in mind they're often pretty busy. So oftentimes your county agent is probably the best place to start as far as getting maybe some quicker answers. So we're going to talk about these nutrients very quickly. We're going to focus on our primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and why they are important for forage production. So we just look at coastal Bermuda grass. To produce 1 ton of coastal Bermuda grass, which is a hybrid variety of Bermuda grass, we need 50 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium. Those are our primary nutrients, so they're obviously needed in the largest quantity. And we're going to talk about each one of those nutrients, why they are important for forage production, and then any little specific twist or things that we need to keep in mind as far as those applications. So nitrogen, most of us understand, is important for yield. It's going to increase our grass production, whether it's Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. Now, Bermuda grass has a linear response to nitrogen applications. You can apply all the nitrogen you wanted to, and then some, and it's going to continue to increase yield as long as rainfall is not limited, of course. And it will also increase your crude protein content, which is important to forage quality for meeting the needs of livestock. Protein is obviously important for growth and production of our livestock. So it has a direct impact on both yield and crude protein content. Now, nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient. I'm sure you've heard people talk about urea volatilizing, or you increase the risk of losing nitrogen in urea. And that is true. Nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient. If you remember back to biology class or chemistry, at some point in most of our lives, we had to learn the nitrogen cycle, where we saw how nitrogen moves through the environment. I can always remember there was a cow in the picture, obviously recycling nitrogen through their manure. There was lightning, etc. So nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient. It can escape into our atmosphere as a gas, volatilize. And that is what volatilization means. It escapes into the atmosphere as gas. It is prone to leaching, meaning that it can move deeper in our soil profile when we have heavy rainfall, along with high rates of nitrogen that have been applied, especially in our very sandy soils. So for me in East Texas, and for a lot of my producers that have extremely sandy or sugar sand soils, that has been a problem at times when people have made fertilizer applications and then we've had a deluge of rainfall. Rainfall is good. We need moisture for incorporation of those nutrients. However, too much rainfall at times can lead to leaching of that nitrogen. So that is why we recommend splitting your nitrogen application. So on that soil analysis we looked at earlier, it recommended applying 100 pounds per acre between each harvest, as opposed to applying all 200 at the beginning. I recommend splitting those applications so that you would have nitrogen readily available for that forage as it started to grow following a harvest, as opposed to being lost into the environment. There are some sources of nitrogen, such as urea, that is at a greater risk of volatilization. So one of my recommendations is, a lot of times urea is a cheaper source of nitrogen, especially on a cost per unit or a cost per pound scenario. But I recommend using urea at times of year when we have greatest opportunity for moisture. So the spring, kind of at the beginning of the season, and then in the fall. So it's a great source of nitrogen, especially for our cool season forages, when we do tend to have more moisture at times during that fall and spring time period. Our second primary nutrient is phosphorus. So I mentioned earlier, phosphorus is important for root growth and development. This is the 1 year with phosphorus pricing over $600 per ton. In a lot of cases, and maybe even more. I know there's a shortage on MAP, which is monoammonium phosphate. But I think there's even some issues with getting DAP, which is diammonium phosphate. So those are two sources of phosphorus. So that has obviously increased prices, and availability has become a challenge as well. So this is probably the one time I do have, if possible. A lot of producers are not applying phosphorus this year. We only need 14 pounds to produce a ton of Bermuda grass. So it's not a huge need. Now, if you have a new planting, if you have a newly sprigged Bermuda grass field or newly seeded Bermuda grass or Bahia grass field, phosphorus is much more important in that scenario as opposed to in an established stand. Now, there are other sources of phosphorus. Poultry litter tends to be high in phosphorus. So that may potentially be an option of means of getting some phosphorus in, maybe at a more economical rate. I lost my, oh, well, they got moved around. So I did mention poultry litter, the source of phosphorus. A few things on animal manures. Poultry litter can be an excellent alternative source for nutrients, but they are highly variable as far as how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium you are going to get from farm to farm, house to house. So you can have poultry litter analyzed. You can send a sample to the soil forage water testing lab in College Station, and they will tell you exactly how many pounds of NP and K are in a ton of that particular product. So just keep in mind that it's highly variable. It could be an excellent source of nutrients. All right, the question is any specific poultry litter? Okay, so depends on where you are in the state as far as the poultry litter that's available. So majority in parts of East and Central Texas are more likely to have broiler litter. There are some layer litter houses. They're not as common as the broiler houses. It really depends on where you're located. I know there's a layer facility in Red River or Bowie County in Northeast Texas. I think there's one in Central Texas that I just heard about the other day at the O.D. Butler Field Day, and I can't remember exactly that location. So if you're looking for a source of poultry litter, you can always contact your county agent. They are likely to know of a potential source. There are some companies that are taking poultry litter and pelletizing it. Unfortunately, that makes it much more expensive as opposed to buying from directly buying from a source. I think there are companies that sell poultry litter that just go in and clean out houses. Keep in mind it's highly variable as to the quality of product you get. I hear a lot of people complain about the quality of the product, and that is going to be influenced by how frequently the houses are cleaned out, who cleans out the houses, is the litter stored before it comes to you. And unfortunately, in most cases, you're not likely to see or be able to test poultry litter until it's on your property. I do tend to only recommend applying no more than 4 tons per acre. That can be another challenge as far as poultry litter. Some outfits will not deliver small loads. They'll only deliver, full truckloads, which is well over that 2 to 4 tons likely per acre. So I do have a list of poultry litter suppliers. Most of that's going to be in East Texas, maybe a few in the central part of the state. I'm happy to share. But I would recommend talking to your county agent. They may know of some different or more sources that I'm not aware of, especially in your location that are going to be closer in proximity. Proximity can also influence the cost because if you start looking at mileage, delivery, that can start to add up. So our third primary nutrient, potassium. I like to say potassium is for persistence, especially for Bermuda grass. So potassium is important for water use efficiency, disease resistance, and will improve cold hardiness. We are most likely to be deficient in potassium in our very sandy soils. So if you have medium to heavy soils with a lot of clay, it's not likely, you're less likely to have deficiency. Now, without a soil analysis, that you're not sure about that. So always get a soil sample to determine if you have or not. But historically, our sandy soils are much more likely to be deficient. It's much more common. So your soil type can influence whether you run the risk of having a deficiency. So this is some research from Overton, so East Texas, very sandy soils on our research property. This is coastal Bermuda grass. On the right, they applied nitrogen, phosphorus, but no potassium, whereas on the left, they applied all 3 primary nutrients. You can see a huge difference, obviously, in weed populations. If you look through the weeds, you can start to see some bare ground, exposed ground. That Bermuda grass has decreased in production and is losing some of its persistence and competitive nature. So like I said, potassium is for persistence. So as far as soil fertility, balanced nutrition will be important. Always start with a soil analysis. $12 is the cheapest thing you can do as far as making a fertilizer choice. And that will really help determine what exactly is needed. If you need to make adjustments because of economics, you can potentially do so. It's going to be easier to do so with that information. And then you can always look at some alternatives such as poultry litter or other animal manures. So our forage species, many of our forage species are going to be sensitive to soil pH. So our soil pH influences the ability of plants to utilize nutrients. For some plants, as our soils become more acidic, it's more difficult for them to take advantage or harvest any nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that is available within that soil environment. Now, there are some plants where a higher soil pH can have the same impact. So it's always important to understand for your forage species and the variety of that species that you're growing, what the soil pH preference is, or the ideal soil pH to support that plant growth and production. So things like our legumes, arrowleaf, crimson clover, white, ball clover, vetch tend to prefer soil pH of at least 6, where something like Bahia grass will tolerate a soil pH of at least 5, down to 5. So very important to know what's the appropriate soil pH. Apply lime if needed to improve that soil pH to support that forage species as far as production and persistence as well. So grazing management is going to be an important component of forage production, especially within pasture systems. Now, different forage species will tolerate a different level of grazing pressure. Take, for example, Bermuda grass and Bahia grass will tolerate close continuous grazing, which most of us are much more accustomed to throughout the Southeast. But unfortunately, without some level of management, even within that particular system, we can start to lose our forage stands. And so this kind of rudimentary diagram will illustrate what happens under a grazing or even excessive harvesting system. So we have to understand what happens below the soil surface. So if we start at the beginning of the season, we have a well-established plant with a nice strong root structure. We begin grazing or harvesting depending on our particular system. We're obviously removing the leaf material. Now, in order for those leaves to regrow, it has to pull from the root structure some carbohydrates, some root reserves to produce new leaves so it can continue to photosynthesize, grow more above ground vegetation, as well as extend that root structure as well. Now, as regrowth begins, like I said, some of those roots will die back because that plant's trying to take those root reserves to produce more above ground plant material. Now, if say we haven't fertilized as needed based on our soil analysis, we have drought conditions, something has maybe slowed that forage growth and production, yet we continue to graze maybe at a too high of a stocking rate considering our weather and fertility situation. As we continue to graze, those plants that have not had the time to recover from that initial grazing event, even more roots are going to die back. And those plants are less likely to persist even during good growing conditions. Fairly shallow root structures, difficult for those plants to capture any nutrients, as well as any deeper soil moisture. And those plants definitely would not survive a drought. And that is what happened to a lot of folks during 2011. Previous poor management in previous years, lack of fertilizer, overgrazing, and continuous grazing during that drought period led to fields that lost stands of warm season perennials, saw a lot more weeds, really weakened those stands, and those stands did not recover. And a lot of those people ended up having to replant, or they potentially sold their property and got out of the forage livestock business. Ideally, we want to be in a system where those plants have adequate rest. Now, most people start thinking, well, I need to start rotating my livestock from my pastures or through my pastures. That could be an option. Another option could be to decrease your stocking rate, to adjust your stocking rate based on forage production, which is obviously going to be influenced by fertilization as well as rainfall. So need to remember that stocking rate is a constantly moving target. So whenever someone asks what's the appropriate stocking rate, well, it really depends. It depends on the forage. It depends on your management as far as fertilization. How, are you going to fertilize? How frequently are you going to fertilize? And then rainfall. That's going to have a huge impact on forage production as well. And then the size of your animals and what do they need. So stocking rate is constantly changing. It's not a static recommendation for everyone in every part of the state and for every forage species. So one thing we have to think about is forage consumption. So how much forage are animals actually consuming? So if we look at general intake guidelines for beef cattle, dry gestating cow, somewhere from 1.8 to 2% of her body weight is what she is likely to consume on a daily basis. Whereas a lactating cow, obviously she's going to consume a little bit more, and that's 2.3 to 2.5% of her body weight. And then we also have to keep in mind different nutritive value or quality of our forages will also influence intake. As forage quality declines, as that forage matures, forage quality tends to decline, so forage intake will often decrease. That higher quality forage, that new growth at the beginning of the year, or that cool season annual versus a warm season perennial, will lead to higher intake. And so this is a great visualization on the left. That's some ryegrass that's overseeded into a warm season perennial side. And then on the right, that's during the summer on a warm season perennial side. So forage consumption is likely to be higher on those cool season forages, since it's higher nutritive value forage compared to those lower quality warm season perennial forages. So just kind of some quick math. An estimated annual intake, if we assume a cow consumes 2.25% of her body weight on a dry matter basis, if she weighs 1,000 pounds, that's going to be 22.5 pounds per day. Multiply that by 365, she's going to consume over 8,000 pounds of dry matter per year. So another question when we talk about forage consumption is, should you let the cows consume everything that is produced? So all of the forage within that pasture system. And no, you shouldn't, because obviously we need forage growth. We need forages there to allow for regrowth. If we continue under that previous pattern of heavy grazing, we keep that forage grazed down, we're going to continue to reduce that root structure, and you're going to have very little regrowth. So you're potentially going to overgraze that forage to the point it doesn't grow back at all. So you're going to have to start feeding hay or supplementation. And you're also going to start to see a lot more weeds pop up in that particular pasture. So if you let her consume 70% of what's growing, and she needs 8,213 pounds of dry matter within a year, then that means you need to produce almost 12,000 pounds of dry matter to support that one animal. So it's a lot of forage that we're having to grow to support those animals. So if we look at what does that mean as far as how do we take that information and convert it to a kind of a stocking rate. So if we calculated that intake at 8,213 pounds of dry matter over 365 days within that year based on 1,000 pound cow, and she's consuming 2.25% of her body weight, but we're only going to let her consume 70% of the forage we actually grow. If our forage production is 6,000 pounds per acre per year, then our stocking rate would ultimately be about a little over 2 acres per pair. So as our animals, as they get larger, as we have larger animals, that means we're going to need more acreage to support those animals, because obviously their forage consumption goes up because of their weight, and then therefore we have to grow more forage. So we're going to have a lot more forage to support those heavier animals. Now, if our forage production is decreased for various reasons, whether it's drought or fertilizer prices are high, so we're going to cut back on fertilization, so that's going to impact our forage production. That will also impact our stocking rate. That means we'll likely need more acres to support a cow-calf pair. And this situation for 1,000 pound cow, we're needing 3 acres instead of a little over 2, with higher forage production versus lower forage production. So that will also influence our stocking rate. So stocking rate should be, like I said, it has to be very flexible. It's going to be based on forage consumption and forage production. And forage production is obviously going to be impacted by rainfall as well as fertilization. So part of that we can control, part of that we can't. So in years when we're anticipating, when we know we have high fertilizer prices, so we're going to decrease the amount or the number of times we fertilize. Maybe we've looked at the drought monitor and it appears that we're going to have some dry conditions during the summer, then that means we need to shift our stocking rate. We need to allow more acres per pair per cow-calf pair to be able to continue to maintain forage production, not only for that season, but as well as beyond that season. That will be very important long-term as well. So kind of our last pillar of forage production is weed control. So there are a lot of different methods of weed control, and most of us think about mowing and then using a herbicide, making a herbicide application. But there are other methods of weed control. One of them is my favorite. It's prevention. We follow best management practices to reduce overgrazing, maintain soil fertility and soil pH for our given forage species. We're less likely to have as much competition. If we're supporting that desired forage, it can likely outcompete a lot of undesirable species, broadleaf or grassy weeds. Now are scenarios, even by following best management practices, that we'll still have some weeds that pop up that we want to control or eradicate. Biological is another method, probably the most common for us is going to be grazing. There are weeds such as crabgrass. If you view crabgrass as a weed that I mentioned earlier, we can control crabgrass in a pasture by simply grazing it, by kind of overgrazing it, preventing it from producing a seed head and reducing those future populations. So that can be an option as well. Like I mentioned, most people think of mowing as the primary source of weed control, primarily because of instant gratification. That weed is in front of us, we mow over it, it's no longer a problem, or at least for the next week or so, it's not our prominent concern. Mowing, unfortunately, is not very effective. It can also become very expensive. In this particular scenario, we're comparing mechanical in that center column, so mowing versus the use of a herbicide on the far right column. It's almost $4 an acre more expensive in this particular situation to mow versus the use of a herbicide. Now, of course, there are some herbicides that are going to be more expensive at cost per acre compared to Graze on Next HL, but you have to keep in mind or think about the weed species that you're trying to control and what's the best recommendation for controlling that particular issue. With the use of herbicides, we always have to remind you that the label is the law. Very important to follow label directions. A lot of producers have seen failure with use of a herbicide, primarily as a result of failure to read the label. So make sure you are following those label directions, not only as far as application rates, but timing of application, whether or not there's any grazing or haying restrictions, if there's other limitations, as well as are there specific adjuvants? Can you mix that herbicide with fertilizer? There's a lot of information beyond just application rate that can be critical to read across a herbicide label. All right, so there's a question, do you have a site to help determine weed type or that can help with weed identification? Unfortunately, there are a couple of websites that can be helpful for weed identification. There is not one that is all inclusive. I'm happy to share a list. I have a list of websites that I think can be very helpful. The Noble Research Institute has a website. Our range group with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, they have a website that is excellent as far as identifying weeds. I'm happy to share some of those. Your county extension agents may have a list as well that they can point you towards. That there are some websites that can help with plant identification. I know if you have any pond weeds, aquaplant.tamu.edu is an excellent website for identifying weeds and ponds. So that's another tool that might be helpful, but we can get you a list. You may just need to reach out to an agent or to myself and we can get you a list of some good websites. So as far as herbicide applications, different methods, broadcast applications is probably much more common, covering large acres or a large number of stems at one time. as opposed to individual plant treatment. Now, individual plant treatment is recommended, especially for some of our brush species or species. Individual plant treatments are going to be much more effective at controlling those species oftentimes than a broadcast application. Spray timing, I mentioned this briefly earlier. This is a big factor that influences success of controlling weeds. It is critical to timing your herbicide application is critical to achieve successful weed control. And weed identification becomes a part of that so that you know whether it's an annual or perennial and what's the best time of year for herbicide application, as well as to make sure you know whether it's a cool season or a warm season weed, because that can also influence your timing of herbicide application. There was a question. All right, so there is someone who's interested in improving forage for wildlife management, primarily white-tailed deer, specifically around our home and pond. We'd like to eliminate weeds and promote native grasses that would have a cleaner look and provide good forage for deer. Bermuda grass looks great, but it's not the best for a deer herd from what I understand. That is correct. Deer do not necessarily graze a lot of grasses, period. So even native grasses are not necessarily ideal for white-tailed deer populations. So there are a lot of forbs, broadleaf plants. There are combinations of plants that we can establish that will actually attract white-tailed deer. There's a mix that my husband actually plants every fall instead of I'm trying to get him to reduce some of his corn feeding. Now he's interested in hunting. And so there are some forages such as cowpeas, oats, and clover that are very attractive for white-tailed deer. Usually I think the biggest concern, if I remember from what I learned from Dr. Billy Higginbotham, our wildlife specialist, is going to be a lot of times protein during the summer. Can often be a challenge, because in the fall, if we have good acorn population, that really supports or helps white-tailed deer. So if you have some oak trees that grow or produce a lot of acorns, that can add to your help supporting those white-tailed deer populations. There are some warm season annual legumes such as cowpeas that you could plant. They would have to be planted into a well-prepared seed bed. The problem with things like cowpeas, they are very attractive to white-tailed deer. So you may potentially, depending on the size of the area you plant, you may have to limit their access with some fencing, because if you don't, they'll pretty much come in and plow it down, and then those cowpeas won't regrow very well. So that can be a challenge. But I'm happy to point you towards, if you want to reach out to me directly, Patrick, I'll be happy to point you towards some information on some appropriate forages for white-tailed deer. So you are correct. Bermuda grass is not necessarily the best. The native grasses could possibly help with, just because of their height, with denning and hiding, but it's not necessarily the best forage for consumption for supporting their diet. But I'm happy to help with additional information. So there was a question about best time for sticker burrs. Now, if you're talking about grass burrs, sand burrs, depending on the product that you're using, if you're using a post-emergent such as Pastora or glyphosate, those sand burrs need to be small and growing. For Pastora, at the 2 to 3 leaf stage, so they're about an inch and a half tall, to have control on sand burrs or grass burrs. If they have grown a little bit larger but they have not produced a seed head, Pastora will prevent seed head expression, so that's another possibility. The other post-emergent option is glyphosate or Roundup. That application could be made following a hay cutting, about 7 days after hay cutting at a pint per acre, or during good growing conditions in a pasture at 10 to 12 ounces per acre. And those sand burrs need to be vegetative, so small. So depending on where you're located, in previous years, I have sprayed for sand burrs as early as May and then as late as June. I've been out in the field limitedly so far this year. I have yet to see any sandburrs, but that does not mean they're not on your property. So I would start scouting, start looking for them. The best way to identify them before they produce that burr is at the crown of the plant. So where it emerges from the soil, is kind of a purple maroon color, which is distinctively different than Bermuda grass. If you're still not sure, a lot of times you can dig that plant up and the burr will still be attached to the root structure. So that's a good way to identify sandburrs before it produces a seed head, because that is when we need to hit it with a post-emergent product. There are some pre-emergent products. Prow H2O would have needed to have been applied January, February. Resilon, which is indaziflam manufactured by Bayer. For sandburr control, they recommend 2 applications, one in December, January time period, and the second one kind of May, June time period. So you're likely late on those. Well, you're definitely late on Prow, and you're likely a little late on the second application of indaziflam. I'm not sure if anyone has looked at just making that application at this time period, how that would impact sandburr populations. So those are my recommendations on sandburrs, grass burrs. So I do have a website. There's quite a bit of additional information on forages. Patrick, as you can see, one of my topics was fall planted forage mixtures for white-tailed deer in Texas. So you can go to Forage Facts. There's actually in the upper right-hand corner, there's a search feature. So you could just type in deer, and that would bring you to that location, that information. I think there's a publication attached to that you would likely find helpful. There are other publications on weed control, fertilization, hay production, best management practices, soil testing, fertility. So a lot of additional forage information that you might find helpful. You can also locate my contact information. So my phone number, my email address, so you can reach out to me with additional questions, or if you need additional information. You can subscribe to Forage Facts. Every Friday, I send out, or I make a new post, and that is sent in an email. Usually about 5 o'clock on Friday, you would get an email with that particular post. They're fairly brief. Try to be very timely in regards to giving you information maybe before a drought or before particular weed issues start to pop up. So with that, I will be happy to answer any additional questions. All right, I don't think there's any questions. If you would like a copy of my slides, there was a request for those, you can send me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat, and I'll be happy to send you a copy.
Also, once we get the recording of this presentation up and posted, we will send you the link also to this presentation, to the video presentation, so you will have the opportunity to go back and watch that video presentation at any time. Also, earlier in the chat feature, you might have seen the posting from Aaron Davis with the link to the evaluation. So at the conclusion of the program, we'd ask that you would go and complete the short, brief evaluation on the program. If you don't have access to the chat feature, whenever I send the link to the video presentation, I will also send the link to that evaluation so you can complete it at that time as well. There is another question back to chicken litter, Vanessa, so I'll let you address that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so the question is on chicken litter as a source of fertilizer and a way to to add some organic matter to a sandy soil. What is the best way to determine the tons per acre for your species of grass? So I typically recommend about 2 to 4 tons per acre. Let me go back to my slides. Oops. Want to find the variability slide on that. I'm going to share again real quick. Okay, so because it's highly variable, and a lot of people will apply broiler litter or poultry litter based on the amount of nitrogen they need. Now, unfortunately, poultry litter has about as much, if not more, phosphorus at times than nitrogen. So, if you haven't used poultry litter before, that's fine going off of the amount of nitrogen. So if you have Bermuda grass, and it's a pasture system, you're typically going to be applying about 75 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, likely at the beginning of the season. And then you may make additional applications kind of depending on what you're trying to achieve. But in regards to poultry litter, we're typically only making one application that season because of availability. And then also poultry litter is kind of a slow release of nutrients. So in that first season, you only get about half of those nutrients. So the other thing, if you make a poultry litter application, say at the beginning of the season in May, June, I would also recommend using another source of nitrogen, such as urea or ammonium nitrate, so that you have some more plant readily available nitrogen kind of at the beginning of that season. So typically 2 to 4 tons per acre for any of our grasses during the summer, and likely is only going to be one application. If you need additional nitrogen, you may need to add that throughout the season. If it's in a pasture system, you'll have to make that decision kind of based on production and rainfall. So if you're having adequate rainfall and you need more forage production, you may want to add some more nitrogen. In a hay meadow, they're definitely adding more nitrogen between hay harvests, even with the use of poultry litter. So that kind of would be my broad generalization as far as a recommendation on that.
Are there any other additional questions? There's one that just came in earlier. You discussed grazing of cows. How do horses differ?
Oh, that's a good question. So horses differ quite greatly as far as they're even harder to manage for grazing because they have front teeth on top and bottom. So they can graze pretty much down to the dirt, down to the soil level. Whereas cattle use their tongue to grasp grass. So they don't graze as close to the soil surface as horses do. So they are going to require much more management. And based on my experience, a lot of people have their pastures with horses overstocked. They have way too many animals. So you tend to have a lot of selective grazing. I see a lot of horses on dirt pastures, so to speak. So you definitely require more resting periods for horse pastures oftentimes, or a substantially lower stocking rate for horses compared to cattle, just because of the nature of their grazing. And then their hoof action is oftentimes can be much more damaging to forage systems.
Well, if there's no more questions, Vanessa, we appreciate you sharing your afternoon, your evening with us. I would just let everyone know that our next program, if you're interested, is going to be on June the 29th, and it will cover tree care. Whenever I send the email with the link to the video recording and the evaluation, I will also send information on that program as well. So if you have questions about trees, tree identification, tree care, tree diseases, our presenters can help answer those questions at that time. But if there are no more questions for Vanessa this evening, we appreciate you joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact your local extension office, whether it be in Leon or Freestone or whichever county you might reside in.